Hello and welcome back to Diplomacy and Discourse. I'm your host AR, and I've got a story for you today that is equal parts geopolitics and a birthday party. Because this year, something happened that diplomatic historians will be chuckling about for a long time. The most powerful leaders on Earth gathered for their annual summit, and the timing landed right atop a milestone birthday for a man at the center of it all. The President of the United States turned 80, and he did it surrounded by allies, rivals, and a flurry of greetings that tell us more about the state of the world than any official communique ever could. Here's the setup. In mid-June of 2026, the leaders of the world's biggest democratic economies met for the G7 summit in the French spa town of Evian-les-Bains. Just one day before the gavel came down, Donald Trump celebrated his 80th birthday. Now, a birthday is usually a private thing, but when you're an 80-year-old sitting president about to walk into a room full of the most consequential people on the planet, your birthday becomes a geopolitical event. Leaders who wanted something, leaders who feared something, leaders who simply wanted to be remembered, they all reached out. And the way each of them chose to do it is a masterclass in modern diplomacy. So here's our plan for today. First, the full lowdown on the G7 itself. What it is, where it came from, and why it still matters in a world that's gotten a lot more crowded at the top. Then, we'll dig into this year's summit and the revealing drama of the birthday greetings. Let's get into it. Let's start at the beginning because the G7 is one of those things people nod along to without ever quite knowing what it is. Picture the 1970s. The world economy is reeling from an oil crisis, energy prices spiking, inflation biting, governments scrambling, and the leaders of a handful of wealthy industrial nations had a realization. Their economies were so interconnected that none of them could fix this mess alone. So in 1975, France hosted an informal get-together of 6 countries: France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They called it the Group of 6. The next year, 1976, Canada was invited in, and the Group of 7, the G7, was born. It started as an economic fire brigade, but over the decades, the conversation widened. By the 1980s and beyond, these leaders weren't just talking about exchange rates and trade. They were talking about international security, democratic values, human rights, the environment. Basically, the whole menu of global problems. Today, the members are Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, plus the European Union, which sits at the table as a kind of eighth voice without holding the gavel. Now here's a question I get a lot. Whatever happened to the G8? Because for a stretch there, it was 8. The 8th member was Russia, which joined in the late 1990s as a gesture of post-Cold War goodwill. That arrangement ended in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. The other members essentially said, "That's not how members of this club behave," and suspended Russia indefinitely. And just like that, the G8 reverted to the G7. Keep that history in your back pocket though, because it becomes very relevant later when we talk about a certain phone call. People also mix up the G7 with the G20. The G20 is a much bigger tent, created in 1999, that includes major emerging economies too, such as China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and more, representing something like 85% of the world's economic output. Think of the G20 as the giant town hall meeting where everyone shows up, and the G7 as the smaller huddle of close friends who already broadly agree on the rules. How does it actually run? There's no headquarters, no permanent staff, no big glass building with a flag out front. Instead, the presidency rotates from country to country every year. Whoever holds it sets the agenda, hosts the big summit, and chairs a year's worth of ministerial meetings. Behind the scenes, each leader has a personal envoy, charmingly nicknamed as Sherpa, like the mountain guides, who does the hard climbing of negotiation and drafts the final statements. The whole thing runs on relationships and consensus, rather than binding law. So if the G7 is just 7 countries plus the EU, and the G20 is so much bigger, why care about the smaller group? Fair question. The honest answer is that the G7's share of the global economy isn't what it used to be. Emerging powers have closed the gap dramatically. But raw economic share isn't the whole story. The G7's real power comes from alignment. These are countries that broadly share the same values: democracy, market economies, rule of law, which means they can move fast and speak with one voice in a way a sprawling, diverse group simply can't. When you don't have to win over a rival with totally different interests, you can act like a steering committee for the democratic world. And that matters most in 3 ways. First, it's a forum for democratic alignment in an era when authoritarian governments are feeling pretty confident. Second, it's a crisis response mechanism, nimble enough to coordinate sanctions, mobilize emergency money, and react quickly when something blows up, whether that's a financial meltdown, a pandemic, or a war. Third, it's an agenda setter. Ideas often get incubated in the G7, like securing critical minerals, governing AI, pushing back on economic coercion, and then spread to bigger bodies. The G7 punches above its economic weight because it writes the first drafts of the rules everyone else ends up debating. Now to the main event. The 2026 summit, the 52nd in the G7's history, was hosted by French President Emmanuel Macron in Evian-les-Bains, that elegant little town on the shores of Lake Geneva. Mid-June, 3 days, and a guest list that went well beyond the 7 members. France invited a wide cast of partners, among them Brazil, Egypt, India, Kenya, South Korea, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and of course, Ukraine, whose fate hangs over every one of these gatherings. To appreciate this year's summit, you have to understand last year's, which was a bit of a mess. In 2025, Canada hosted in the Rocky Mountains, and the meetings was so fractured that the hosts couldn't even get everyone to sign a joint statement. The big rift was between the United States and everyone else, over trade tariffs and over President Trump's suggestion that Russia ought to be welcomed back. Insiders call it a G6+1, and the host issued his own summary rather than a unified communique. In diplomatic terms, like a dinner host, quietly admitting the guests couldn't agree on dessert. So France came into 2026 determined to project more unity, and it largely succeeded. The headline agenda items were heavy: the ongoing war in Ukraine and how much more military support to send, the global scramble for critical minerals, those rare minerals that power everything from electric cars to missiles, and how to depend on any single country to supply them. Tensions with China over trade and industrial overcapacity, and the increasingly urgent question of how to govern artificial intelligence. With the summit ever bringing in executives from the big AI companies to talk safely. Hanging over all of it was a genuine diplomatic surprise: the announcement of a preliminary peace deal between the United States, and Iran, aimed at cooling down conflict in the Middle East. Big stakes, in other words, but the story everyone was whispering about in the hallways was the birthday. Here's what makes the birthday so fascinating, though. A birthday greeting seems trivial, like a card, a call, a quick message. But when world leaders send them to a sitting US president on the eve of a major summit, nothing is trivial. Every greeting is a calculated move. So let's read the signals, one leader at a time. Start with Vladimir Putin, because his was the loudest. The Russian president picked up the phone and called Trump directly to wish him a happy birthday. And the timing was no accident. Getting a warm, personal word in just before the G7, the very club that kicked Russia out, is a power move. Remember, this is the leader of the country that was expelled in 2014. A friendly birthday call is Putin's way of keeping a private channel open to the one Western leader who has floated the idea of letting Russia back in. There's ego at play too. Putin understands that flattery lands with this particular president, but it's strategic ego. By being warm right before Trump walks into a room full of allies who want to tighten the screws on Moscow, Putin is trying to soften the ground. And there's a rich irony hovering over it all. Even as these pleasantries are exchanged, Ukraine has been racing to build its own weapons to defend itself against Russia. The friendly call is happening against the backdrop of a war that's very much still being fought. It's diplomacy as theater, and Putin knows exactly which seat he wants. Then there's Vladimir Zelensky, who also called, and his challenge was the trickier one. Ukraine's president has to do two things at once that don't naturally fit together. He has to be warm and personable, because he genuinely needs Trump's goodwill and continued American support. But he also has to keep reminding everyone that there's a war going on, slipping in updates from the battlefield so the suffering of his country doesn't fade into the background noise of a birthday. But what I find smart about Ukraine's approach is the hedging underneath it. Zelensky isn't putting all his eggs in the basket of American generosity. Ukraine has been developing its own capabilities, homegrown systems like its interceptor drones, precisely so it isn't entirely dependent on allies whose enthusiasm can wobble. So his birthday call is charm with a purpose. Stay close to Trump. Keep Ukraine top of mind at the summit, but never look so needy that you've lost your leverage. It's a tightrope he's been walking for years. Now for one you might not expect. Kazakhstan. President Tokayev sent a formal telegram of congratulations. Why would a Central Asian nation bother? Geography mostly. Kazakhstan lives in one of the toughest neighborhoods on the planet, squeezed between Russia to the north, China to the east, and not far from Iran. When your neighbors are giants, you survive by being friendly with as many powerful players as possible, especially distant ones who can serve as a counterweight. So, a polite, formal telegram to the American president is Kazakhstan signaling that it would like to be on Washington's radar, a potential partner for trade, investment, maybe even those critical minerals the G7 is so eager to secure. It's a quiet, low-cost gesture that says, we are open for business, and we'd like a friend far from home. Across the world, the president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., posted a birthday greeting on Facebook. A social media post might sound casual, but it was doing real work. Marcos is under serious pressure at home, and his country is locked in tense standoffs with China in the South China Sea, where Chinese vessels have reportedly confronted Filipino ships. For Marcos, the United States is the indispensable security partner. the big friend who helps balance against a much larger neighbor. So a public, friendly birthday message to Trump is aimed at two audiences at once. To Washington, it says, "We value this alliance." To Beijing, it says, "Don't forget who stands behind us." Doing it publicly, where millions can see, is the whole point. It's diplomacy meant to be overheard. And then there's Germany, which gave us my favorite story of the bunch, and the most touching. Germany's greeting came from two people, which reflects how the country is structured. There's a ceremonial president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who serves as head of state. Think of him as the dignified, above-politics figure. And there's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who actually runs the government. Both reached out. But the gift is what gets me. Germany presented Trump with a copy of his grandfather's birth certificate. Trump's grandfather emigrated from Germany generations ago, and digging up that document was a beautifully chosen gesture. On the surface, it's a sweet, personal nod to the president's roots. But look closer, and it's a quiet reminder of the deep, centuries-old ties between America and Europe, saying, in effect, your story begins here, in our shared history. And our two continents are bound together whether the politics of the moment are warm or cold. In a year when transatlantic relations have been strained by trade fights, handing the president a piece of his own German heritage is a graceful way of saying, we are family, even when we argue. That's soft power in a single sheet of paper. Beyond the birthday theater, the Evian Summit didn't get real work done, more than the troubled 2025 gathering. Leaders reaffirmed their support for Ukraine, pledging more air defense systems and tighter sanctions on Russia's energy sector. They built on the previous year's efforts to secure critical minerals, formally launching an alliance designed to coordinate financing and cut their collective dependencies on any single non-G7 supplier of rare earths to below 60% by the end of the decade. They engaged directly with leaders of major AI companies on safety, and the summit provided the stage for that preliminary US-Iran peace announcement, a genuine diplomatic headline. It wasn't all harmony. The underlying trade tensions between the United States and Europe didn't vanish. They were managed, but not resolved. But compared to the near breakdown of the year before, France could fairly claim it had stitched the group back into something resembling a united front. And that's the lesson. Shared values do not guarantee shared policy. Unity has to be rebuilt at every single summit. So what does all this birthday diplomacy actually tell us about the world in 2026? Quite a lot, if you squint. First, it confirms how central the United States, and this president personally, remains to everyone's calculations. Rivals court him. Allies reassure him. Small nations angle for his attention. Second, it reveals European anxiety dressed up as warmth. Germany's heritage gift is lovely, but it's also a gesture of a continent worried about whether the old transatlantic bond still holds. Third, it shows the survival strategies of smaller players. Kazakhstan's Telegram, the Philippines' Public Post, each maneuvering to befriend the powerful and hedge against the dangerous. And the dueling calls from Putin and Zelensky captured the central drama of our age in miniature. Two leaders on opposing sides of a brutal war, both trying to win the ear of the same man on the same day. The birthday, in other words, was a kind of X-ray. For one strange moment, the usual posturing slipped, and you can see the skeleton underneath. Who needs whom? who fears whom, and who's hedging their bets. So that's the Birthday Summit, a 50-year-old institution born from an oil crisis, still gathering the world's leading democracies to wrestle with war, trade, technology, and resources. And doing it, this year, against the backdrop of a man's 80th birthday and the parade of greetings that came with it. If there's a takeaway, it's this. In diplomacy, the small gestures are never really small. A phone call, a telegram, a Facebook post, an old birth certificate. Each one is a sentence in a much larger conversation about power. The G7 remains a vital, if imperfect, forum, navigating a world more crowded and contested than the one it was built for. Its future depends on whether its members can keep choosing unity over division, summit after summit, even when their interests pull in different directions. And the birthday reminded us that behind all the institutions and acronyms, global politics is still made by human beings, with egos, histories, anxieties, and the occasional desire to be remembered on their special day. That's all for today's episode. If this gave you a new way of seeing the headlines, I'd love to hear from you at diplomacyandiscourse@gmail.com. If you're listening through YouTube, please give us a like, subscribe, and comment something down below. As always, thank you for spending your time with me. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep reading between the headlines.